It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker for the session on translating love from the Sanskrit. We have with us today Anusha Rao. Anusha is currently a PhD candidate in the study of religion at the University of Toronto, where she works on the intersection between literature and philosophy in early modern Vedanta. Her monograph is titled How to Love in Sanskrit and was published with HarperCollins, India in 2024. Anusa also writes a monthly column titled Sans the Sacred for the Deccan Herald. Okay, without further delay, I now request Anusha to please continue with the session. Over to you, Anusha.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here. Special thanks to Professor Ipshita Chanda for initiating the research forum, and to Anupama for inviting me here, and Saurabh for the lovely introduction. Uh, so I must confess, I can't see any of you at the moment because I have my screen shared. So please let me know if you're having trouble watching my presentation or hearing me. I'll start off without too much of a delay. So, as Saurabh said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, where I work on early modern Vedanta. But I'm here today to talk about this book that was released by HarperCollins last month, How to Love in Sanskrit. And it's an anthology of Sanskrit love poetry in translation. While it's meant for a general audience, we do think, my co-author and I do think that it would be of interest to lots of people in the Indological community and scholars of South Asia for a variety of reasons, which we'll go into shortly. I should also begin with the disclaimer that when we say how to love in Sanskrit, we also mean how to love in Prakrit and Apabhramsha as well. So all of these languages are interlinked, and when we speak of Sanskrit, we've also drawn from several sources in Prakrit and at least a couple in Apabhramsha as well. So to begin with, I thought it would be interesting to look at the beginnings of translations of Sanskrit erotic literature. And that brings us, of course, to Richard Burton's translation, published in 1883, the first translation of the Kama Sutra in English. And this is particularly fascinating because if you look at the picture on the slide of the front of the book, it is supposed to be published by the Hindu Kama Shastra Society. Now, what is interesting for us is that the society never existed. So it was so scandalous to publish something like the Kama Sutra at that time that Burton had to actually make up a fake society to publish it. And his name is nowhere to be seen on the cover. And if you look at the bottom of the page, it says for private circulation only. In fact, the Kama Sutra published in Sanskrit too initially was for private circulation only. We've come a long way since then. But fortunately or unfortunately for us, this was the first text, the first representation of Sanskrit erotics and love, if you will, that went viral at that time. So while the translation tends to be Victorian and Orientalist, we still have to contend with popular imagination associating love in Sanskrit with the Kama Sutra, when it turns out that most of Sanskrit literature dealing with love is actually in a completely different genre, which I'll come to soon. Now, we have come a long way since Burton, but translations today still have plenty of issues. So, here is a small example of how academic translations in Sanskrit fail. So, this one is from a very well reputed scholar, published in 1971. I'll just read out the translation on the slide. O deity, be pleased to ordain for our beloved one an addiction to other women. For male persons who enjoy the love of one female person cannot discriminate between merits and demerits of women. Now, if you're a bit bewildered, you're not alone. This translation is really confusing and it seems to miss the main point, although the translator clearly gets what the verse is saying. So here is our translation of the same verse in our book. Dear God, make him hang out with other women more. He does not seem to realize what a catch I am. Now, if you really look at it, the problem with the verse, the translation on the left, is that the person writing it is an academic who does not want to miss out on any of the details of the verse. So it says male person, the word is in the masculine gender, the translator wants to include that. So this is a kind of pedantic attention to irrelevant detail. And this is a very good example of that. So, not all translations are this attentive to every detail in the verse, but it is a problem that we see in varying degrees. So a translation I've looked at actually, so it's looking at a particular text that describes the trees in a garden. So a character in a play describes all the trees in a garden. And the translator has actually made up a list of the scientific names of all the flora and fauna there and simply lists it out, like reels off a list of those. So all of these are really difficult. It's really difficult to enjoy poetry if it's translated like this. So in our book, what we do is to ignore things that are natural to Sanskrit but would be very convoluted in English. So, for instance, the moon is called Shita Kirana in Sanskrit, the one with cool rays. But unless that idea of the moon having cool rays is really relevant to the verse, we simply translate it as the moon. Now, that was an academic translation, but here is a poetic translation published as recently as 2017, and it's still laden with issues. So let's look at this. It's titled Hair. Once untied, my woman's hair tumbles down, damp, filling the air with perfume, only to be tied again before it clings to her loins, burnt by the white flow of passion. Now, this reads as poetic, but we're still not clear what the main idea of the verse is and what the point of the poem is. Now, the real problem in this one is when we compare it to the source in Sanskrit, which I did. So, I have a translation of my own up here on the slide. But mind you, this is not in our book, and we'll say why in a moment. So, my beloved's hair, having given up attachment or oil, and having drunk in smoke, came to be freed or liberated. But after contact with her hips, became bound once again. How catastrophic is attachment to worldly things? Now, sneha, which can mean both oil and attachment. So this verse works on two levels. The first level is just about the hair. So when a woman oils her hair and washes it, traditionally, it gives up its oil. So my beloved's hair has given up oil. In other words, she has washed her hair. And then after washing hair, women used to dry it with fragrant smoke, if you recall. So having drunk in smoke, so the hair is drinking in smoke as she dries it with that fragrant smoke. And then she leaves it loose to dry, so it comes to be freed. But then once she frees it, her hair is really long, so it goes all the way down to her hips. And then she ties it up again, so it comes to be bound. But this verse works on the other level as well. So, having given up attachment, if you recall, the path to liberation in most Indian systems of philosophy is explained to be in terms of giving up attachment to material things. So, since there's a pun on the word sneha here, uh, the lover's hair has given up attachment, presumably to the material world, and having drunk in smoke. Now, this is a reference to penance. There's a particular kind of penance which involves sitting in the middle of four fires, and so one presumably drinks in smoke. So the hair has performed penance as well. And what is the result of this penance? It comes to be freed, it comes to be liberated. So it reaches moksha in the Sanskrit. But then it comes into contact with her hips, contact again in the sense of attachment. And so, because of its pull towards her hips to some material object, it comes to be bound. That is, it becomes a part of samsara again. And so the poet cleverly uses the series of puns to make his point, which is how catastrophic is attachment to worldly things. Now, if you compare the verse translation on the left and right, there barely seems to be any kind of coherent idea that is in the source that is also there in the translation. On the other hand, what the translation does do is to exoticize the verse in some way. So this to us is a problem of curation. Is this verse really translatable? And of course, everything is translatable, but is it enjoyable in translation? Also, is it even a romantic verse if the main point being made is just a clever series of puns? So, where a verse or a poem would need reams of footnotes, we have not included it in our collection. Um, Another problem we see with most modern anthologies of translation of Sanskrit verse is that they refer to very limited sources. So we have gone over 200 works in Sanskrit, and we have extracts from about 80 texts within this book. So the main issue is of two kinds. Those who are able to write successfully for general audiences don't have access to a lot of Sanskrit primary sources that have never been translated, and they're only able to access prior translations, which leads to a verse that does not convey the intent of the original at all. Or scholars, on the other hand, tend to pay excessive attention to detail, which means that we would not see a readable translation that a general audience can appreciate without a load of footnotes and other distracting uh, sources. So these are the problems with the existent translations. But what have we tried to do? So our philosophy of translation generally flows organically from the nature of the text itself and from Sanskrit aesthetic theory as we understand it. And throughout, our choices have been guided by the purpose that the translation should be able to give aesthetic pleasure or rasa to the reader, to a general audience who does not have a specialized understanding or familiarity with the cultural tropes of the text. So in some ways, our work is like a commentary. A traditional Sanskrit commentary offers a little explication when it's necessary for the reader. And we do this using titles, which are, of course, not there in the Sanskrit source, but do give some context where otherwise it would be necessary. But what exactly do I mean by our philosophy of translation flows organically from the nature of the text and from aesthetic theory? So, for one, the genre of all of these most Sanskrit love poetry is not in the Kama Sutra kind of genre, which has only a handful of texts, but it is in the genre of the Muktaka, of the independent verse. So, this Muktaka is known for being self contained, which means to say it needs nothing else to explain it. And we find plenty of muktakas, thousands of them, in anthologies of poetry in Sanskrit, in the middle of epic poetry, in the middle of plays. We find plenty of these verses that can just be picked up out of their context and put elsewhere, and they still make complete sense. You don't need to know who said it, you don't need to know anything else about the characters. In fact, Sanskrit literature is known for giving us no details about the authorial context in terms of social or economic or political context. And sometimes it's in fact misleading about the context. So, in the introduction to the book, we talk about how a poet from Kashmir, say in the 11th or 12th century, could well be writing about trysts that lovers have on the banks of the Godavari River without ever visiting the Godavari River, but instead drawing completely from this text that is so popular, the Gaha Sattasai in Prakrit. In fact, text can mislead us about their context. But what we do know, what we have a plethora of information about, in fact, is the aesthetic theories that underlie these texts. So when poets write with carefully constructed poetic convention, whether it's in Sanskrit, Prakrit, or even Apabhramsha, we have lots of theoretical discussion about what effect the poetry is intended to produce, what the poetry is suggesting, what it is saying, what it is missing out, and so on. And this is what we have drawn from. The characters in Muktakas are mostly anonymous, which is intentional because their experience is meant to be universal. Because they're not any one specific person, they're a placeholder for everyone. Um, and this principle of the Muktaka itself guides our curation as well. So, Sanskrit poetry is built upon building blocks of poetic conventions. For instance, we have several sets of mythical birds, such as the chakora birds, which are supposed to be a symbol of fidelity. The loyal lovers who are parted every night and who reunite again every morning. And these stand in for human lovers who are separated. But if we have to explain all of this, then the reader is not going to be able to spontaneously enjoy a poem the way it's meant to be appreciated and the way it would have been appreciated in the past when someone read a Sanskrit poem. So, as a matter of curation, we just don't include verses of this kind in the collection. The second way in which we draw our principle of translating from the text itself is that of one key idea. So, in the book, we compare a Sanskrit verse to an Indian wedding. So, in an Indian wedding, which we've all been to, you have the bride and groom, but you also have lots of finery, people dressed in dazzling clothes, lots of jewelry. You have a wonderful buffet to eat from, but it can be easy to miss out who the bride and groom are, and that should not happen. So, similarly, in the Sanskrit, we have sound effects that cannot be replicated in English, such as alliteration. We have many figures of speech that come very naturally to Sanskrit, particularly hyperbole, which would come across very contrived in English. But all of these in the Sanskrit are in service of one key idea of the verse. And that key idea should is like the bride and groom of the verse. That is what we should miss. So while we translate it into English, we have taken away some of the other appendages of the verse. So we've taken away the alliteration, the meter, the hyperbole, but the key idea remains exactly the same. So it's our contention that it's very possible to not give up scholarly rigor in translation, to get the main point of the text across very clearly, while also giving up these less important portions of the poem itself in favor of the key idea. So, what you see on the slide is one of our translations, which illustrates this one key idea. So, why am an atheist? So, the title, of course, as I said, is not part of the Sanskrit verse, and that gives some context and tells us what to expect. When the Creator made her, if he had his eyes open, would he have let her leave heaven? Surely not. If he had his eyes shut, could he have achieved such perfection? No chance. Therefore, it is proved that the Buddha was right. There is no Creator. So, the author of this verse is actually the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti. So, he's only half joking when he says the Buddha was right. And that little piece of context that can just give the reader a chuckle or help them appreciate the verse better is at the bottom of the verse. But again, it's not necessary to simply appreciate the verse. And finally, the other thing that I should speak about is the idea of dhvani in Sanskrit, which is very, very prevalent in all of Sanskrit aesthetic theory from about the 10th century, which tells us that a verse is superior, a poem is superior when it communicates through suggestion instead of directly stating what it means to say. So here is a translation from the book titled Self Goal. Her husband is very possessive. He does not let her go out at night to pick the mahua blossoms. Simple minded as he is, he leaves the house at night to pick the blossoms himself. So here we can see very clearly suggestion or implicature at work. It is not stating the fact that her husband is simply making things easier for her by stepping out at night himself and giving her the house, presumably to meet her lovers. But what I'd like us to notice here is that there is still no ambiguity at all in the verse. So the aim is to produce rasa in the reader through suggestion rather than through explication. But nevertheless, there should be no ambiguity in what the verse means. And all Sanskrit theorists would agree with this idea, which is why we have translated in a way that keeps the point of the verse clear as well. So sometimes we do need a little bit of explication in order for a contemporary reader to make sense of the verse. That is unavoidable, but we definitely try to not spoil the punchline. I thought I would end by walking us briefly through the translation process by using a single verse as instance. So this one says, if she were but a pond, her eyes two lilies, her face a lotus, her slender arms lotus stalks, her dancing eyebrows ripples, I would plunge at once into the cool waters of her loveliness and be rid of the searing pain that threatens to rip life from limb. So this is our translation, just so you have an idea of what the verse is saying. And then I'll read the verse in meter. I can't sing by any stretch of the imagination, but just to give you an idea of the poetic meter. नेत्रेन्दीवरिणी मुखाम्बुरुहिणी भ्रुवल्लिकल्लोलिनी बाहुद्वन्द्वमृणालिनी यदि वधूर्वापि पुनः सा भवेत् तल्लावण्यजलावगाहनजडैरङ्गैरनङ्गानलज्ज्वाला जालमुचस्त्यजेयमसमाः प्राणच्छिदो वेदनाः. So this meter that you just heard is the Shardula Vikridita, or the tiger's play. And it's supposed to mirror the gait of a tiger as it goes on a hunt. And of course, even if one were to write an English meter, one could never replicate the effects of Sanskrit meter. The second interesting feature that you might have noticed as I recited is the caesura in this meter, which is at the end of 12 syllables. So the last 7 syllables kind of end on a sai in the Sanskrit. So that would be after asamaha. So asamah pranachido vedanaha. And so that gives you the effect of this pranachido vedanaha, refers to this pain that cuts away at life itself. So the sound of the prana chido vedanaha, it sounds harsh enough to mirror this idea of unbearable pain. Um, and the last 7 syllables show this hint of grief with the pause, the caesura there. And none of this can be replicated in the English. So we've not even tried to do that. So this is what we have lost in the verse, and that's quite a bit. But then we also have, so this is a more literal translation of the same verse, which shows you the structure in the Sanskrit. And it's filled with compounds. Sanskrit is known for its infamous compounds that are so difficult to parse and make sense of. And if you see the verse here, borderless fire, flame, multitude, spewing is actually a single word in the Sanskrit. And so you can have compounds that stretch across the whole verse to two lines in the verse. Half of the verse can just be a single word that's a compound. But English, on the other hand, is a very powdery language. So when we translate it into it, you have to necessarily break up these compounds. We also have, for instance, here eyebrow wine waves in the Sanskrit. And eyebrows are naturally compared to wines in Sanskrit. It's a metaphor that becomes almost commonplace. But in English, to say wine waves makes no sense. So we changed that to dancing eyebrows to communicate the same idea, but slightly differently. Then, so this is generally what we've done with the verse. We've given up the meter, the effects of the caesura. We've switched around the compounds and changed a couple of metaphors to make it more readable. We've also removed the word reservoir, for instance, which sounds more like engineering, and used lake instead for poetic effect. But we keep the general idea the same. And so our translation of pranachido vedanaha as the searing pain that threatens to rip life from limb, we think pretty much communicates the kind of pain of separation that is being expressed in the verse. So what else have we changed? One of the things that we've changed in our book is the way verses are categorized. So what you see on the left is a modern anthology in translation. And if you see the categories, they are pretty much what you would find in old traditional Sanskrit anthologies, which is women speak to their lovers, young men speak to their male friends about their lovers, and so on. Which is not as interesting as the way we have categorized it, which is in terms of the various stages or phases of a relationship, how to flirt, how to quarrel, how to make love. Since the Muktaka is self-contained anyway, you can just plug and place verses in these different categories rather than sticking to the old conventions of, say, what an unchaste woman says and so on. Yeah, so I'll just end the talk with this instance of where we've changed the context for effect. So this one says, don't marry an academic. The break is here and the semester is done, stealing his attention like a second wife. His lectures are all that he can think about. I can flirt all I like. I'm not getting any tonight. As you probably did guess, there is no semester in Sanskrit. So, what are we translating in this way? The Sanskrit source says Dvitiya Tithihi, which is the second day of the fortnight. And it's tradition that the first day of the fortnight is not meant for study. So, scholars, students would keep aside their books on that day. And so, this woman in the verse is complaining that the day is over and now it's the second day of the fortnight when her husband is no longer going to pay her any attention, which we've translated as the break and semester, respectively, because we think it captures the essence of the verse. Um, Finally, just one last slide, which I've titled Extrasensory Perception. So this retains the symmetry in the verse, and we've used the symmetry a lot in our translation to replicate some of the effects of the Sanskrit, where you have the same words but mirrored. She does every little thing I like, he gushes. Little does he know, he likes every little thing she does. Um, and this too, I think, is a very faithful translation. So I'll end here so that we have time for questions. But the whole point of our translation is that it is quite possible, and indeed it's desirable. What we must attempt to do is to preserve the scholarly integrity of the source while also creating translations that are possible for a general audience to enjoy. I'll pause here and I'll stop sharing so that I can see the meeting. Sure.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear, but
Yeah,
not
this
able
is
to see
Shweta.
everyone.
I wanted to know in page number 61, there's In My Heart. What is the
Mhm.
central idea of that? Uh, I actually liked it, but it says, or sewn tight into the fabric of my heart by the thread of my thoughts. So, what
Yeah,
I've not read the Sanskrit equivalent. I mean, the translation is very good, but I think the Sanskrit one would be much better than this. Hello.
hello. Hi.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I hope you
Hi.
can hear me.
Yes, yes. So I wanted to know the central idea of that actually. I've
Yeah,
not read the
so
Sanskrit equivalent. I think it would be much, much, much better because it's in Sanskrit. So I just wanted to know the central idea.
sure. Yeah, so this verse is by Bhavabhuti, who is known for depicting, uh, who is known for his actual character development within his text, which is pretty rare in the Sanskrit. And the commentator reads this verse as actually going deeper and deeper, expressing deeper and deeper affection. So it starts with having melted into the heart and ends with being sewn tight, which is somehow um, uh, even more inextricable. So the verse moves step by step into
Okay.
expressing deeper levels of love and attachment.
Okay. Thank you. It's a very good book. I've read the whole book. I plan
Thank you.
to. I actually even messaged you on DM you. It's
Mhm.
I like the book very much. Maybe I will sit and write the Sanskrit equivalent to understand it better.
Sure, yeah, yeah. Feel free to write to me if you have any questions. Glad to
Okay.
hear you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, Anusha. My name is Keshav. I've joined in from Bangalore.
Hi.
Hi. I'm currently doing my master's from RSS. I think it's called SCSU now, in Sahitya. So we do a lot of Kavya Prakasha and Vanyaloka, mostly theoretical. I don't think I'm doing the kind of work you are, which is the practical aspect of it.
Mhm.
But what I've noticed during my reading is many verses, especially in works like the Mahabharata, have a very subtle mix of different rasas. Right? You
Mhm.
might, we could get into an argument about which rasa dominates over the other, right? But there's plenty where there is a very subtle mix of, say, for example, Karuna rasa and Veera rasa. Right?
Mhm.
And if you are, as you said, trying to be loyal to the source,
Mhm.
this becomes even more difficult when you're translating, especially when you have more than one rasa. I just want to understand how you went about doing it in a situation like that.
Absolutely. That's a great question. But what we're trying to do in our translation is not to translate a single rasa, though. I think it's quite possible for a verse to have a very a beautiful combination of, say, the Shringara and Veera, or
Yeah,
Karuna and Shringara, and so on. In fact, the Ramayana itself could be, as the whole text, could be an instance for both Veera,
yeah,
Shringara, Karuna, all of these. Uh, but I think within a single verse, there can be multiple rasas. But the key idea which generates those rasas is a single one. And I think we've tried to be loyal to that, the unity of that idea. So we have some verses from the Ramayana there where Rama is missing Sita, and the primary emotion there is Vipralambha Shringara. But even if there are multiple ones there, so when Rama wants to cross over the ocean, for instance, and he's saying, so if we were to try to translate those verses, um,
mhm,
I think so long as one remains faithful to that idea of the verse, which might include more than one rasa, I think one can do a good job of translating it. In fact, it would probably be a bad idea to ignore one emotional dimension of the verse altogether, just to try to remain
yeah.
with a unit.
Mm. Awesome. Well, thanks. I haven't got around to reading your book yet, but I do plan to catch it at some point in the next couple of months. But great work. I think it's really important that you have somebody versed in Sanskrit and is aware of the aesthetic theories and the rasa theories behind it, involved in translation. I think that's awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Anusha. This is
Hi.
Parjanya.
Hi.
Congratulations on the book to both
Thank
of
you.
you. I went through the ebook version. I'm waiting to get my hands on the physical copy. I'm in the
Great.
States, so it releases. I was really interested to see the Chandrakirti verse there, and Dharmakirti, sorry. And what I noticed at the end was, before you made that comment, was that the line there, that the Buddha was right, that there is no creator. And
Mhm.
so immediately my thought went to, but is that what was said in the Sanskrit verse,
Mhm.
or is that your, like, a translator's choice to sort of push away that ambiguity? Because the way they say it in Madhyamaka Buddhism is not that there is no creator, but something similar to the creator is no thing. Not nothing, but
Mhm.
not a thing that can be described by any regular conventional word, which is why the Buddha remained silent when asked about the creator. But that silence was not supposed to be in itself ambiguous. It was supposed to be the loudest kind of silence that someone, that if you understood it, you understood it. Which
Right.
I guess, I mean, I guess you guys did understand it. So to me, like, to see that you mentioned that translation there, to me really tells me that you guys got that message.
Right.
So really like that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. That's fascinating. So I think the nuance exists in the philosophy, but in the verse itself, if so, what we've translated as "there is no creator" is "tasmat sarvam akartrikam jagadidam." So this world is without a creator, without a maker. Which is what we've translated. So I think part of it is, in this case, it's not about our translational choice as much as it is about the nature of poetry. That if you try to bring in this philosophical nuance into this verse, which is just about how beautiful this woman is, that there can't possibly be a creator. I think you can't bring that philosophical nuance into a poem about a beautiful woman. So it seems to me that Dharmakirti is simply speaking in a lighter vein here, and he is so within the original source verse itself. I think that philosophical nuance is not a part of it.
So just to quick follow up then, would that kind of nuance, because we're mostly used to reading poetry these days, not like when when you sang that verse, it has a different kind of uh, I mean, it comes across differently than just even reading the Sanskrit text. And so I think a lot of these nuances might come out in the performative, recitative aspect of this kind of poetry, when it is said in when it is sang in meter, or when it is when it is I don't know, felt. But the thing I wanted to add is, the reason I really love your book is because I'm going to get married next May, and I was looking for something that I can use to, I don't know, customize the rituals and the ideas that go around a marriage. And I think I found something to go from with your book, especially when you said, don't fall in love with an academic, and like all of those things. So really, that it's really thank you for this.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear. Mhm. That's a great question from Nidhi. So I can read that out. When were the verses you've translated written? How much does the style of the independent verses change or stay the same over time? As to when they were written across a range of time periods. So we have verses starting from the Rig Veda, which is of course not the genre of the Muktaka itself. But we have verses from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, which are some of the oldest. We have the Gaha Satasai in the first century CE. And then we also have verses written by contemporary Sanskrit poets in the book. And the interesting thing is that the structure of the independent verse itself stays exactly the same. So most of Sanskrit and Prakrit poetry is kind of fixed in time in a way. And the structures and the poetic conventions that govern them, and the genre itself keeps being replicated over time, if that makes sense. So a poet writing much later would still be writing in exactly the same style and following the same unwritten or mostly written rules and conventions that govern the genre. So one of the fun things we're able to do in an anthology is to pick stuff up from many different genres. So you can have a satire or farce where you could have verses such as "Don't Marry an Academic" or some of the other ones in the book, and you can have someone like Kalidasa writing about a woman's smile really beautifully, and the two would be in very different genres. But because this is an anthology of muktakas, you can bring those two together, which is what we've tried to do. Anupama, I'm not sure if you want me to go ahead and read the next question or someone else. Sorry? Yeah, yeah. That's a great one too. So, on what basis do you differentiate between what you've called an academic translation and a poetic translation, and what would you term your own? Um, so, what I presented as an academic and poetic one were, I would say, at two ends of a spectrum. Of course, there is no such thing as merely an academic translation and merely a poetic one. I think everyone who's translating poetry, all scholars translating poetry, would try to do something that is both. So I simply presented two ends of the spectrum as because one of the translations was not rigorous in terms of being faithful to the source idea. It was completely different. And the other one I termed more academic because it focused so much on every little aspect grammatical of the source verse that it left out the key point, which was what would bring rasa to the verse. So I would say I, like most other translators, are striving for something that does both. And I think this book does accurately represent the source, but in ways that are readable as poetry. So if you just read the verse or the poem itself, it looks like, or it would read like poetry. You don't need to refer back to the original. In fact, so unlike translations of, say, Rumi into English, some of which native speakers say has nothing to do with what Rumi actually wrote, I think my co-author and I feel fairly confident that if you were able to resurrect Kalidasa somehow and bring him to our modern world and show him our poems, he would agree that we've represented his ideas quite faithfully. So we have that kind of confidence in our work, and we're trying to bring both academic and poetic aspects of the verse together. I hope that answers your question. Anupama, do let me know if there are any other questions.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Yeah. Hello, Anusha. It's a very interesting work, but one of the bits I found a bit puzzling was when you said there are certain lesser important elements in the poem which you chose to ignore. So I wanted to know, how do you find out which element is lesser important? Because if you look at a poetic text, each word or each element is there for a reason. For example, if a particular word has been used for the moon, I know there are like hundreds of words, but if a particular one has been used, there must be a reason there. So when you say you left those out, or sometimes did not even try for the sake of readability or ease of access in English, I think you are at some level erasing the difference, aren't you? And the point of a translation is that it is not an English text; it is a Sanskrit text. So, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that, as you can guess, we've repeatedly encountered and had to deal with. So my answer to that would be that all of those in Sanskrit cohere together to create a beautiful poetic text. Undoubtedly, the meter, no one can say, is unimportant. But for instance, in the verse that I had up on the slide, "Why I'm Not an Atheist," what we've translated as "when the Creator made her," actually in the Sanskrit is "Ene Kshana Sundari," so a doe-eyed, beautiful woman. So, as you know, in Sanskrit, it's very common simply to refer to women as Vamoru, Karabhoru, Ene Kshana, and so on, just referring to their eyes as beautiful, their thighs as being those of an elephant's trunk, and so on. So one could make a more faithful translation to the source, presumably, by retaining all of these, as many translators do. But for me, the whole point of Sanskrit aesthetics is that it should engender some rasa in the reader. The reader should be able to enjoy it. So I would say it is meant to be a Sanskrit verse. So if we retain all of those aspects and do a more foreignizing kind of translation to make the reader identify that as foreign, why would a reader enjoy the verse or even try to look for what the Sanskrit might be? I think this is a problem that Sanskrit translations generally suffer from in the first place, that they're translated in a way that they're not accessible to a general readership at all, or not enjoyable. And isn't the whole point of poetry that it should be enjoyed? So if there is a way, so for instance, I really enjoy Arthur Ryder's verses, and they do retain some sense of rhyme, which is not there in the Sanskrit. Uh, but if it is possible to do metrical translations, that would be great. But even if you do it in English meter, can you really mirror the effect of the Shardula Vikridita or the Sraddhara or all of these beautiful Sanskrit meters? It's not possible. So I think it's honest on the part of a translator to say this is just not doable. What we are going to focus is on the key idea of the verse, which is what creates the enjoyment on the part of the reader. And if we have to sacrifice these other elements of the work, such as calling the woman doe-eyed when the verse is not really about her eyes, I think that's an okay compromise to make. Especially, yeah, yes. Sorry. Sure. Yeah. So this is a good question too, and one that we've repeatedly dealt with in on Twitter or other social media. So why have we just said how to love in Sanskrit when we've also written about Prakrit and Apabhramsha? Well, I think the first is simply for the sake of brevity. You cannot title a book "How to Love in Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha." And secondly, the writers writing in all of these different languages are still operating within the poetic structures uh, that Sanskrit is mainly known for. So they're aware of Sanskrit work. Prakrit work is constantly aware of Sanskrit work. It is governed by many of the same poetic conventions and many of the same poetic structures. It's the same people who write in Sanskrit who are also using Prakrit in their writing, and Sanskrit is simply better known. So it's in the sense of what we would say traditionally, pradhane vyapadeshaha. When something is pradhana, it is more important. You just mention it and you take the others with it. So we say in our introduction that when someone invites you over for tea, they don't just give you tea, they also give you some snacks and cookies and something else. And this is similar to that. We just say how to love in Sanskrit, but with Sanskrit you also get all of these other verses from really beautiful Prakrit verses and a couple of Apabhramsha ones as well. So one for brevity, and two, simply because the people writing in these are operating under the same kind of conventions. Thank you. How do you go about choosing words or dropping words while considering it a translation from the source? Omission of cultural tropes and rhythms or rhymes. Yeah, that's a good question too. So I should clarify that when I say we're choosing words or dropping words, it's um, I don't really mean that the verse itself or the basis of the verse itself changes. It is more the case that, like I said, if the moon is called, so in Sanskrit, most of these operate under metrical constraints. So if I need a word for the moon that has 4 syllables, then I need a 4-syllable word. So I'm going to use something like Shitakara, one with cool arms which are raised. So when that idea itself is not necessary for conveying the meaning of the verse, if I go about translating every woman as doe-eyed or which is just an endearment. So in instead of saying darling or honey, you would have doe-eyed woman or oh woman with thighs like an elephant's trunk. Is it really possible to poetically translate woman with thighs that resemble an elephant's trunk into English and have a book of poetry in it? We would say that it would be antithetical to the rasa itself. So only in this case, when what is meant by woman with thighs like an elephant trunk is simply beautiful woman. So we don't have any qualms in translating that as a beautiful woman. So in that sense, we've deviated from the source, but I don't think it's a matter of the content of the verse itself that has been changed. And as to omission of rhythms or meters, so when you look at poetry in English today, a lot of it is free verse. No one, so if you look at earlier translations of Sanskrit, more Victorian translations, you would have these extra constraints of meter. But even if you translate it into English meter, like I said, you cannot replicate the vibrancy of uh, Sanskrit meter. So, if you want to retain every single aspect of the source text, the only recourse would be to read the source text itself. So, I think we would still call ours a translation rather than an adaptation, simply because it's impossible to. I mean, all translators do make some compromises, and so long as the um, crux of the verse, as envisioned in the Sanskrit itself, is conveyed, I think it would qualify as a translation. I did see a message, but I can't see it in the chat. I mean, I heard a message, but I can't see it in the chat. All right. Thank you so much for having me here, and I can leave my email if someone wants to get in touch. Thank you so much again. Bye.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Department of Comparative Literature and India Studies, I would like to thank Ms. Anusha Rao for engaging in today's conversation with us. Thank you, Ipshita ma'am, Anupama, and Rafid for taking the initiative to organize the research forum with great interest. I would like to extend my gratitude to all the professors from the department for extending their support. Last but not the least, I would like to thank everyone present here for making the time to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.